Hey friends, it's Alex here at the Code Wolf again, and in this video we're going to continue our journey through the new features of ASP.NET Core 7, this time focusing on minimal APIs. Let's check it out. Alright, so minimal APIs were actually introduced in .NET 6 last year. They were one of the cool new feature sets that we got with that release. Now, if you missed this new framework approach, it basically provides a really minimal and simple syntax for mapping endpoints to handler methods. So instead of using a lot of boilerplate code with controllers and some of the startup files involved with all that and some of those configurations that we always had to perform, minimal APIs basically just provide a really streamlined approach to writing simplistic APIs. So you can easily author RESTful web services with very small amounts of code. So just as an example, a get method that returns a hello world message could be as simple as one line of code. Now, I'm going to assume you have a basic working knowledge of minimal APIs for this tour, but we want to start looking at what .NET 7 brings to the table here. One of the main goals of .NET 7 seems to be to increase the parity of the feature set between this minimal API set and the full featured web APIs that we get when we do use that approach with controllers and such. So over in Visual Studio, I've put together a few examples, actually 6 to be exact, that show some of the cool new features of minimal APIs in .NET 7 and some of the ways that they're starting to have feature parity with the more robust option. So there's 6 options, but I'm actually going to start with number 2 in this case, and we'll see why later. So my favorite new feature of minimal APIs are the introduction of filters. And we've had filters for a while in .NET. They've been part of MVC and Web API for years, but now we get them in minimal APIs. And this was one of the most notable absences in the feature set from last year, in my opinion. But we can now add filters using this method called add endpoint filter. And this accepts 2 parameters for the endpoint context and then the next endpoint filter delegate in the pipeline. And this allows us to execute code before or after the next filter in the pipeline is executed. So in this case, I've set up a filter that checks to see if the incoming request URL contains the code wolf in the query string values. And if it doesn't, then we want to return a bad request. And if it does, then we want to just invoke the next handler in the pipeline here. So I'm going to set a breakpoint inside of the map get method and inside of the add endpoint filter. And remember, the map get method up here is the actual handler method for the /filters endpoint, but we're appending this filter on afterwards. So over in our browser, I have this API running, and let's test this out. We can enter in a secret key here. And remember, it's looking for the code wolf, but let's enter in something different. Let's enter in the code tiger. And if we hit execute, you can see first we land in our endpoint handler because these execute before the main handler for that endpoint runs. So our hello world up here has not been returned yet. Now, if we step through this, you can see that the code wolf was not found in the query string value. And so we actually drop down into this bad request and we return directly from here. So now if I hit continue, we never hit return hello world and our main handler method is never called for the /filters endpoint. And we can see that down here. We can see it says that the response status is a 400, it's a bad request, and it was not passed on to our main handler because it didn't get past the filter. So if we were to change this now to the proper value of the code wolf and click execute, now as we continue through this, we do land on our handler method and we get our hello world 200 response. Now the next feature I want to show is another great addition that was missed before, and that's the introduction of file uploads. So we can now bind files to these really simpler handler methods. And so here I just have a line of code that then opens up a file stream and writes this to the file system. So I'll set another breakpoint in here as well. And let's test this endpoint over here with the upload. And I'll just choose a file real quick. So I have this hello.txt and open that up and click execute. And we can see that our file did indeed bind to this handler method. And there's our hello text right there. And if I were to continue, we get a 200 back. Now, we can also see that that file was uploaded. It just ended up in the main root directory of our app since we didn't really specify a more specific file path somewhere else. But that's a really cool new feature, and receiving files in your endpoints and in your APIs is always useful, so have fun with that. Now, the next feature is array binding. And this one is really simple, but also just kind of a nice to have feature. And it might streamline certain flows if you want to use this. But it basically lets us just append multiple values into the query string. And Minimal API will take care of assembling those into a string array for us. So in this case, we could pass in multiple names. So let's try that now over in our browser. So on this array binding method, let's say try it out, and we'll say add string, and we'll have the first name be Joe, and we'll add another one that says Jason. And if we set a breakpoint here in our method again, let's execute this. And of course, those names will be populated in our string array parameter. And we can see Joe and Jason there. And now when we continue, we'll see those printed back in the response. So that works as expected. It's just a nice little feature for array binding. Now, the next new feature I want to cover is also related to binding request data, and that's this AsParameter attribute that we can apply to models we're trying to bind in our request. So further down, we have this to-do class, which accepts an ID, a name, and this isComplete Boolean value. Well, what this AsParameters does is it allows us to include those values in the query string as separate values, and it will just assemble those for us into this model. So let's see what that means in practice. Over in our browser, let's open up this to-dos endpoint and say try it out again. And so for the ID, let's put a value of 1. And for the name here, we can just say buy groceries. And for isComplete, we'll set that to false. And when we say execute, now if we mouse over this object here, you can see that those values were bound to our to-do object here, even though those are actually passed in the query string. So if I were to click continue here, you can see that that was originally sent here as separate values in the query string, but on the server side, it was assembled into a cohesive object for us. And that's just kind of a nice feature that streamlines binding those different query values into a usable object in our code. I really like this feature personally. Now, the next feature we're going to look at has some caveats here, but Minimal APIs now include some additional features for working with the OpenAPI specification. Now, the OpenAPI specification is basically a way of describing RESTful APIs, and different platforms and cloud services can consume those documents to understand more about your service, and you can also use them to make sharing your service with other developers or other tools much easier. It's just a way of providing a descriptive look at your service. So for example, if we look at this swagger.json file that's generated up here, this includes all kinds of metadata and information about our endpoints. And this is the kind of stuff that we want to generate when we're working with OpenAPI. Now, Minimal APIs include this additional method that says with OpenAPI, and we want to return an OpenAPI operation from that. And we now have the option to supply all kinds of information. So we can add a summary and a description, and there's a lot of other values or other properties that we can set on this operation. In previous versions of Minimal APIs, we could configure some of these values, but now there's just more of them available, and we can gain greater control over how our service here is described using the OpenAPI specification. Now, the reason I said there's a caveat here is that this is currently not working correctly as of preview 7. So we have these methods here in our code, but when we actually run the app, the correct metadata isn't actually generated in the final output. There are some GitHub issues open for this right now, and this will definitely be addressed by release, but I can't actually fully demo this right now. But I just want to make you aware that in .NET 7, we have all kinds of new options for working with the OpenAPI specification. Now, the last feature I want to show you, we can see by revisiting the top here with number one, and that's these route groupings, which are a really cool feature. And the reason we have to look at this last is that this actually affects all of the other endpoints. So what we're able to do now is use this map group method. And if we look at this, this returns a route group builder. And so we can pass in a prefix here, and this is going to append that prefix to anything that we build off of this route group builder. So what this lets us do is create groups of routes. So you can see this returned or this is being assigned to a min API variable. And I'm using that min API variable throughout our code and adding our route handlers onto that min API object. That way we can use that group further up to apply configurations to all of our endpoints at once. So we're using this add endpoint filter here. And what this is going to do is add an endpoint filter to anything that we build off of this min API variable now. So you can see in this filter, I'm actually adding a response header after the response has been generated. So that happens up here. And then we can assign this secret header value that just says the code wolf on it. And then we return this and the pipeline continues and so on. But what that lets us do is that if we actually reinspect these responses over on the right, if you've been paying attention carefully, you'll see they all have this additional response header that says secret the code wolf, because that's what we specified over here. So again, if we were to go back and look through these, you can see they all have this value. And that's because there is a filter running off of that map group method that ties the filter to all of our different methods. And what's really cool is that there are additional extension methods we can use here. So there's allow anonymous or cache output and all these different methods. When we call those will now be applied to every endpoint in our little API here. So minimal APIs have all kinds of cool new features in .NET 7. These are the 6 that I really want to highlight. If you like this video, please hit subscribe and look for the next video here in this .NET 7 series very soon. Thanks again.